Imagine it's the 14th of July, 1923. You're a 34-year-old schoolteacher living in Berlin, Germany. Your apartment is small but comfortable, tucked above a bakery on a quiet street. You have a savings account that took you 12 years to build. Every Friday, you walk to the same shop and buy bread, milk, and a little meat for your family. Your life is not rich, but it is stable, predictable, the kind of life where tomorrow looks a lot like today. If you have ever wondered why some families seem to glide through history's worst storms while others lose everything in the blink of an eye, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, in different countries and different decades, and it always ends the same way. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. By November of that same year, your life savings could not buy a single loaf of bread. Not because you spent it, not because it was stolen, but because the money itself had quietly turned into paper. This is what historians call hyperinflation, which simply means prices rising so fast that money loses its value faster than you can spend it. In Germany in 1923, prices were doubling every 2 days. Workers were paid twice a day, in the morning and at lunch, because by evening their wages would buy half as much. The schoolteacher in our story did everything right. She saved, she worked, she trusted the system. And the system betrayed her, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, then all at once. This video is about a question that sits underneath almost every story of financial survival and financial ruin in history. Why do poor people and rich people seem to experience time itself differently? Why does waiting feel like safety to one group and danger to another? The answer is not about intelligence. It is not about hard work. It is about something much older and much quieter, something that has shaped who survives economic storms for the last 200 years. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Time is not neutral. It does not treat every dollar, every saver, every family the same way. Think of time like a river. If you are holding a boat, the river carries you forward. If you're holding a bag of sand, the same river slowly dissolves what you are holding until nothing is left. Wealthy people throughout history have tended to hold boats, assets that move with the river, land, businesses, ownership of real things. Poor and middle-class people have tended to hold sand, cash, fixed wages, savings accounts. The river does not care about effort. It only cares about what you are holding when it rises. This is the secret key to understanding almost every financial collapse in modern history. It is not that poor people make worse decisions. It is that poor people are structurally forced to live in shorter time horizons, while wealthy people are structurally able to live in longer ones. A person living paycheck to paycheck cannot think in decades. They are thinking about Friday. A person with inherited land, or a diversified portfolio, or a business that generates income without their daily labor, can afford to think in decades, because their survival this week does not depend on this week's wages. Time becomes a luxury good. And like all luxury goods, it is unevenly distributed. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And let's look at the first major case that shows this pattern clearly. Argentina, December 2001. The country had pegged its currency to the US dollar for a decade, meaning one Argentine peso was officially worth one American dollar by law. It felt stable. It felt safe. Ordinary families kept their savings in pesos, trusting the peg the way the Berlin schoolteacher trusted her bank. Then the peg broke. Within weeks, the peso lost about 70% of its value against the dollar. The government froze bank accounts in a measure that became known as the corralito, a word that literally means the little corral, because savers were fenced in and could not withdraw their own money. Estimates suggest that millions of middle-class Argentines watched their life savings shrink to a third of their original worth, while they were legally blocked from accessing what was left. Here is what ordinary people actually experienced. Retired teachers who had saved for 30 years found their pensions worth almost nothing within a single season. Small shop owners who kept cash reserves to restock inventory could no longer afford to restock at all. Streets in Buenos Aires filled with protesters banging pots and pans, a sound that became the symbol of the crisis, called the cacerolazo. People who had planned their entire retirement around stable currency discovered almost overnight that the ground they were standing on was never as solid as they believed. But notice who did not lose everything. Argentines who owned property in Buenos Aires, who held assets in foreign currency before the crisis, or who owned shares in companies that exported goods abroad, were largely insulated. Why? Because their wealth was not trapped in pesos. Their wealth moved with the river instead of dissolving in it. A factory owner exporting beef to Europe got paid in dollars, while a retired civil servant living off a peso pension watched his purchasing power evaporate. Same country, same crisis. Two completely different outcomes based entirely on what form their wealth was held in and how much time they had to react before the wave hit. This is the first piece of the pattern. Wealth that is liquid and mobile survives currency collapse. Wealth that is fixed and trapped in local cash does not. The poor and the middle class are usually the ones holding local cash, because local cash is what wages are paid in. The wealthy are usually the ones holding mobile assets, because mobile assets are what ownership produces. This is not a moral failing on either side. It is a structural difference in what kind of financial weather each group is exposed to. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If you knew with certainty that your local currency would lose half its value within 5 years, what would you do differently today? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. It is not just about currency. It is about something even more basic, the ability to wait. This leads to the second part of the story. Let's travel to Zimbabwe in 2008. By this point, the country was experiencing what is widely considered one of the most extreme cases of hyperinflation in modern history. At its peak, inflation was estimated by some economists to be running at rates so astronomical that prices were doubling in less than a day. The government eventually issued a $100 trillion note. Not $100, 100 trillion, and it was barely enough to buy a loaf of bread on some days. Picture an ordinary nurse in Harare. She's paid at the end of the month, as nurses usually are. But by the time she receives her salary, walks to the market, and tries to buy groceries, prices have already risen again. Her entire paycheck, something she worked an entire month to earn, might not cover a week of food. People started carrying money in wheelbarrows and plastic bags, not because they were wealthy, but because the bills themselves had become almost worthless per unit, and you needed enormous stacks just to buy basic items. This is the cruelty of hyperinflation. It punishes anyone who is paid in fixed intervals and forced to wait even a few days before spending. Now compare this to Zimbabweans, who had access to foreign currency, particularly US dollars, or who owned physical assets, like farmland, cattle, or stakes in businesses that sold goods internationally. While ordinary wage earners were destroyed by the speed of collapsing currency, those holding foreign currency or physical assets effectively froze time in their favor. Their wealth did not melt while they waited. It held its shape. This is the second piece of the pattern, and it builds directly on the first. In times of crisis, the people who suffer most are the ones forced to interact with money on a short time delay. Paid today, spend tomorrow, and lose value in between. The people who suffer least are the ones who can hold their wealth in a form that does not decay while they wait. This is why poor people, throughout history, have been forced into what economists sometimes call short-time preference, meaning they must prioritize the present because the future is too uncertain or too painful to plan for. Meanwhile, wealthy people are able to practice long-time preference, planning years or decades ahead, because their wealth is structured to survive the wait. Look at what happened next. Let's examine a third case that shows this same mechanism from a completely different angle, not a currency collapse this time, but something quieter and more familiar, the 2008 global financial crisis in the United States. On the surface, this looks like a banking story. Subprime mortgages, meaning home loans given to borrowers with poor credit who were statistically more likely to default, were bundled together and sold as supposedly safe investments. When millions of these borrowers could not make their payments, the entire financial system buckled. Now compare this to Zimbabweans who had access to foreign currency, particularly US dollars, or who owned physical assets like farmland, cattle, or stakes in businesses that sold goods internationally. While ordinary wage earners were destroyed by the speed of collapsing currency, those holding foreign currency or physical assets effectively froze time in their favor. Their wealth did not melt while they waited. It held its shape. This is the second piece of the pattern, and it builds directly on the first. In times of crisis, the people who suffer most are the ones forced to interact with money on a short time delay. Pay today, spend tomorrow, and lose value in between. The people who suffer least are the ones who can hold their wealth in a form that does not decay while they wait. This is why poor people, throughout history, have been forced into what economists sometimes call short-time preference, meaning they must prioritize the present because the future is too uncertain or too painful to plan for. Meanwhile, wealthy people are able to practice long-time preference, planning years or decades ahead because their wealth is structured to survive the wait. Look at what happened next. Let's examine a third case that shows this same mechanism from a completely different angle. Not currency collapse this time, but something quieter and more familiar. The 2008 global financial crisis in the United States. On the surface, this looks like a banking story. Subprime mortgages, meaning home loans, given to borrowers with poor credit who were statistically more likely to default, were bundled together and sold as supposedly safe investments. When millions of these borrowers could not make their payments, the entire financial system buckled. But look closer at who actually lost their homes and who did not. Between 2007 and 2010, an estimated 9 million American families lost their homes to foreclosure, meaning the bank illegally took the house because the owner could not keep up with payments. Many of these families were working-class homeowners who had little financial cushion, meaning they had almost no spare savings to survive, even a few months of reduced income. When the crisis hit and jobs were lost or hours were cut, these families had no runway, no extra time to wait out the storm. Banks foreclosed within months in many cases. Now look at wealthy investors during the very same crisis. Many of them had enough liquid capital, meaning cash and easily sellable assets, to simply wait. Some legendary investors, including Warren Buffett, used the crisis as a buying opportunity, purchasing shares in major companies like Goldman Sachs and General Electric at deeply discounted prices, because they had both the patience and the financial runway to wait for recovery. By 2013, U.S. stock markets had not only recovered their losses from the crisis, but surpassed their previous highs. The people who could afford to hold on, who had enough time built into their finances to simply wait, came out ahead. The people who needed their money immediately, who had no time to spare, lost their homes permanently, even though the broader market eventually recovered. This is the third piece of the pattern, and at this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Berlin in 1923, Argentina in 2001, Zimbabwe in 2008, and the United States in 2008 are four completely different countries, 4 different decades, 4 different specific causes: hyperinflation, currency collapse, monetary disaster, and a banking crisis. But underneath all 4, the exact same mechanism is operating. Those who could afford to wait survived. Those who could not afford to wait lost everything. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand, believing collapse is always about bad luck or bad decisions. If you're still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all 3 case studies together and add a deeper layer underneath them. In every single one of these events, time behaved like a weapon, but only for people who could not afford patience. Think about what patience actually requires. It requires having enough resources stored up that you do not have to act today. A wealthy landowner in Weimar Germany could simply hold on to land and wait for the chaos to pass, because land does not care about inflation. It cannot be inflated away the way paper money can. A struggling pensioner had no such luxury. Her entire financial existence was denominated in a currency that was dying in real time, and she had no alternative asset to escape into. This is the core economic mechanism behind almost every wealth gap that widens during a crisis. Wealth that can be deferred survives. Wealth that must be spent immediately does not. The wealthy are not simply richer in money. They are richer in time. They can afford to wait out a storm. The poor are forced to weather the storm in real time, exposed with no shelter, because their financial structure does not allow delay. Who gets hurt the most when this pattern plays out? Look closely at history, and you will see the same groups appear again and again. Middle-class savers who trusted that putting money aside in a bank account was the responsible thing to do, only to watch inflation or currency collapse erase years of discipline in months. Pensioners, who are particularly vulnerable because their income is fixed, meaning it does not adjust upward when prices rise, locking them into a slow erosion of their living standards. Small business owners who hold most of their wealth in local cash flow and local currency reserves, leaving them exposed the moment the local economy turns. And who walks away largely fine? Historically, it has consistently been those who held real assets, things with intrinsic and tangible value like land, productive, businesses, or commodities, rather than purely financial promises like cash or bonds denominated in a currency that can be printed without limit. It has also consistently been those who had geographic or currency diversification, meaning their wealth was not tied to a single failing system, but spread across borders or currencies that were not collapsing at the same time. Consider Lebanon in 2019 as one more example, because it shows this human cost with painful clarity. Lebanon's banking system effectively froze, and depositors were informally restricted from withdrawing their own US dollar savings, even though those deposits were technically still listed on paper. Doctors, engineers, and middle-class professionals who had spent decades building dollar savings accounts watched those accounts become almost inaccessible. Some lost what is estimated to be more than 80% of their savings' real value, even though, technically, the numbers in their bank statements never changed. The money existed, on paper. It simply could not be touched, and what could be touched had lost most of its purchasing power. Meanwhile, wealthier Lebanese families who had moved capital abroad before the crisis, into foreign banks or foreign property, were largely shielded from the freeze entirely. This is the human cost of the pattern, stated plainly. The system does not usually take wealth away with violence. It usually takes wealth away with delay. A frozen account. A currency peg that breaks after you've already trusted it. A paycheck that arrives one day too late to beat. Rising prices. Delay is the quiet weapon, and those without spare time absorb its full force, while those with spare time simply step aside and let it pass. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the people who came through these events have in common? Not the lucky few who guessed right by accident, but the ones who consistently appeared on the surviving side across multiple unrelated crises in different countries. The historical record shows that those who came through this period largely shared three characteristics. First, they held a portion of their wealth in something that existed outside the local system that was under stress. Whether that was foreign currency, foreign property, or international assets, they were not entirely dependent on one government, one currency, or one bank to protect their savings. Second, they maintained what might be called financial slack, meaning extra resources or reserves beyond their immediate monthly needs, so that even if a crisis hit, they had weeks or months of runway before being forced into a panicked decision. Third, and this is the part most people overlook, they tended to think in longer time frames well before any crisis appeared, not because they predicted that specific crisis, but because their financial habits were already built for patience rather than urgency. They were not gamblers reacting fast. They were planners who had already positioned themselves to wait. This is not financial advice, and it is not a prediction. It is simply what the historical record shows, repeated across Weimar Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, the United States, and Lebanon, despite those events having almost nothing else in common politically or geographically. The mechanism rhymes across time, even when the specific triggers differ. Let's return to the school teacher in Berlin in November of 1923. By the time the German government introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark to stabilize the economy, her old savings were essentially gone. But here is what history also tells us. Those Germans who had, even modestly, held real assets, a small plot of land, shares in a business, foreign currency from relatives abroad, were able to rebuild far faster than those who had held only cash. The school teacher's story is not unique. It is one version of a story that has repeated, with different costumes and different currencies, for the past century. The deeper lesson here is not about Germany or Argentina or Zimbabwe or any single country. It is about understanding that time is not something everyone experiences equally when systems are under stress. For some, time is an ally that lets wealth compound and recover. For others, time is an enemy that quietly erodes everything they have built, simply because they are forced to interact with money on a shorter, more desperate schedule. This is the relationship with time that separates how poor and wealthy people experience economic history, not because of who they are as people, but because of the financial structures that surround them. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.